The studio sat in a silence it hadn't heard in more than 4 decades. No buzzing cameras, no spinning wheel, no excited contestants rushing to their places. Just still, deep, heavy, almost sacred. The kind of silence that forces a man to confront the truth he has avoided for years. Pat Sajak stepped inside slowly, his footsteps echoing across the polished floor. He wasn't dressed as the charismatic host America grew up watching. No sharp suit, no warm smile prepared for the audience. Today, he was simply Pat, a man standing in a place that had shaped him, defined him, and, in many ways, consumed him. He walked toward the iconic wheel, the symbol of an era he had carried on his shoulders since 1981. Millions of viewers saw it as a game, a show, a routine part of their evenings. But to Pat, this wheel was more than that. It was a companion, a silent witness to his growth, his struggles, and his triumphs. He reached out and let his fingers glide across its surface, cold, still unmoving for the first time in years. It wasn't spinning under studio lights or surrounded by applause. It just sat there, quiet and patient, waiting for him to say what he came to say. Pat looked around the room. Every corner held a memory. The spot where contestants hugged him after solving a puzzle. The place where he stood year after year, joking with Vanna White, turning an ordinary evening into something magical for millions of households. The board where letters flashed with excitement, lighting up not just puzzles but people's lives. But today, none of that energy was here. Today, the studio felt like an old friend waiting for a difficult conversation. He inhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. He had rehearsed this speech in his mind 1,000 times, yet now, standing here, it felt impossible to put into words. Behind all the smiles, behind all the easy jokes and smooth hosting, there had been something else growing inside him, something he ignored for years because it was easier to keep moving than to stop and face reality. Pat finally broke the silence. "This place has been my home," he whispered, his voice echoing through the empty set. "More than any house I've lived in, more than any office, this stage raised me." He paused, letting the truth settle in the air. More than 4 decades of his life gone in a flash the moment he decided to walk away. That decision didn't come suddenly. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow build, a feeling that started as a whisper and grew louder each season. Pat took a few steps forward, stopping at the center of the stage where he had stood thousands of times before. He closed his eyes, almost hearing the applause of an imaginary audience. He pictured his younger self, confident, sharp, a rising television star stepping into a role he had no idea would change his life forever. He opened his eyes again, and the room snaps back into silence. "When I started, I thought I'd be here a few years," he said softly. "I never imagined it would become a lifetime, but as the years passed, something shifted. The world changed, television changed, the audience changed, and Pat, he changed too. Yet, he kept going because he felt a responsibility, a duty to the fans who invited him into their homes every night. He didn't want to disappoint the people who saw him as part of their family, but deep down, he knew it couldn't last forever. He walked toward Vanna's podium and touched the smooth edge thoughtfully. Vanna White had been more than a co-host. She had been his partner, his friend, someone who understood the pressure and the privilege of carrying a show that had become a cultural treasure. He whispered, almost to himself. Even Vanna knew. This day had to come. The confession he had been holding inside for years finally began to surface. Pat wasn't leaving because he was tired of the work. He wasn't leaving because he didn't love the show anymore. In truth, he loved it too much. And that love came with fear that he wouldn't be able to give the same energy, the same spark, the same spirit that made Wheel of Fortune special. The thought of staying past his prime, of becoming a shadow of the host people adored, that terrified him more than anything. "I never wanted to outstay my welcome," he admitted. "I wanted to leave before the show felt different, before I felt different." He walked back toward the center of the stage, staring up at the glowing puzzle board one more time. Even switched off, it felt alive, as if waiting for him to spin one last puzzle into motion. "This show deserves the best version of its host," he said, "and I knew I couldn't give that forever." There it was, the truth, the confession, the weight he had carried silently for years finally spoken out loud as he slowly made his way toward the exit. Pat turned back and gave the empty studio one final look, not as a host, not as an icon, but as a man who gave his life to his craft and was finally ready to walk away. The lights remained dim, the wheel stood still, and Pat Sajak, for the first time in more than 40 years, stepped off the stage. Not as the face of Wheel of Fortune, but as someone free. The memory begins in a conference room far from the bright lights of the Wheel of Fortune stage. The walls were lined with posters celebrating decades of the show's success, smiling contestants, confetti flying, Pat and Vanna posing beside the iconic wheel. But on this particular day, none of that warmth existed. The room felt tense, almost cold. Pat Sajak sat at the long table, hands folded, listening as a group of executives talked rapidly, tossing around words like modernization, new energy, format refresh, and younger audience appeal. They weren't suggestions, they were demands. The television landscape was evolving quickly, and they wanted Wheel of Fortune to evolve with it. Pat kept his face composed, but inside, something didn't feel right. For more than 40 years, he had guided the show with simplicity, charm, and genuine human connection. His style wasn't scripted, it wasn't manufactured, it was authentic, and that authenticity was what fans loved. But as he listened to the executives, he realized the show he knew was slowly being reshaped into something different. Something he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. One executive said, "We need more viral moments." Another added, "We want shorter dialogue, quicker transitions." Someone else recommended, "More scripted humor, less improvisation." Each suggestion felt like a tiny crack forming in the foundation Pat had built his career on. He nodded politely, taking in every word, but deep down he felt a quiet ache. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was lost art, because for the first time he felt like a guest in his own home. The meeting ended after an hour of back-and-forth negotiations. Pat gathered his notes, walked out of the room, and headed down the hallway. He planned on returning to his dressing room, but instead, he found himself stepping outside into the parking lot, needing aerial air, away from artificial lights and forced conversations. He leaned against his car, staring at nothing. No cameras, no audience, no laughter, just a man alone with a truth he didn't want to face. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't having fun anymore. The show that once felt effortless, natural, and joyful was now wrapped in pressure, deadlines, and expectations. Every season the demands grew heavier. Every year, the show felt a little less like the one he had fallen in love with back in 1981. Pat knew television had to evolve. He wasn't against change. What change without heart? That was different, and that was what he feared the show was becoming. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. In that quiet moment in the parking lot, he knew something important had shifted. He could no longer deny it. The moment that everything changed was right here, not on stage, not in front of fans, but in a silent parking lot where he finally admitted the truth to himself. Wheel of Fortune wasn't the problem. Pat wasn't the problem. Time was. He realized he had reached a crossroads. He could stay and fight the changes, or he could walk away with dignity before the magic slipped away. And right there, under the open sky, Pat Sajak made the first unspoken decision, the decision that would eventually lead to his goodbye. As Pat Sajak continued hosting year after year, fans saw the same familiar smile, the same calm voice, the same effortless charm that made Wheel of Fortune feel like comfort television. But off camera there was a side of Pat's life that the world never truly saw, a side filled with quiet struggles, hidden exhaustion, and health battles that slowly began shaping his future. It started subtly. A little fatigue here, a late-night muscle ache there. Nothing alarming at first, just the natural wear and tear of a man carrying decades of responsibility on his shoulders. But soon, the signs became harder to ignore. The long shooting days, the constant standing, the pressure to maintain the same energy he had in his 30s. It all began to take a toll. Pat had always been the type of person who pushed through anything. Sickness, stress, sleepless nights. He kept going because he understood what the show meant to people. Millions tuned in every evening, many of them after long, draining days, searching for a moment of joy, comfort, or escape. Pat took that responsibility seriously. He didn't just host a show, he provided stability. But behind that stability was a human being who was beginning to feel the weight of time. Friends and colleagues noticed the change before he did. He seemed quieter off camera, more reflective. He took longer breaks between shoots. His jokes, once endless and effortless, began coming a little slower. Even Vanna White, who knew him better than almost anyone, could see it in his eyes. Pat was tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Then came the health scare that shook him to his core. Pat rarely spoke about it publicly, but it forced him to pause his life in a way he never had before. It made him see, with painful clarity, that he was not invincible, that even legends have limits. The scare made him confront something he had avoided for years, the reality that hosting a fast-paced, high-energy show wasn't something he could do forever. He remembered the fear in the eyes of his family, the silent prayers in hospital hallways, the moments lying awake at night wondering if he would ever feel like himself again. Recovery was slow, and during that time, he realized just how much he had sacrificed: his health, his peace, his time. But the biggest realization came later. Pat confessed in private conversations that the pressure of the job wasn't what it used to be. The expectations grew larger as he grew older. People didn't just want him to host. They wanted the same Pat Sajak from decades ago. The same jokes, the same voice, the same youthful spark. And delivering that, day after day, felt like lifting a mountain. He loved the show deeply, but he also knew he couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. The stress wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He didn't want to reach a point where he was forcing himself to smile. He didn't want fans to watch him struggle instead of shine. And in one quiet moment, he admitted something difficult: "I don't want to stay until the job breaks me." That sentence became his truth, a truth he had ignored for too long. Pat realized that stepping away wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. It was acceptance. And most importantly, It was the beginning of healing, because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is put down the weight he has carried for far too long. Pat Sajak had always been a man who balanced two worlds: the bright, polished world of television and the quiet, personal world of his family. For decades he moved between them with remarkable discipline, hosting long shooting days during the week and trying to squeeze in meaningful moments at home whenever he could. But as the years passed, those two worlds began drifting farther and farther apart. His family had grown used to the rhythm of his life. They understood the show came first, at least during filming season. They understood the late nights, the rehearsals, the meetings, the travel. They understood that the man America saw every evening at 7 p.m. was the same man they loved at home, but one who had less time, less energy, and fewer quiet moments to give. Still, they supported him, always. But one evening changed everything. Pat sat with his family in their living room. The atmosphere was casual, warm, relaxed. His daughter sat across from him scrolling through her phone while his wife, Leslie, prepared some tea. Pat was exhausted from a long week of tapings. His shoulders slumped a little and his usually bright eyes looked tired. His daughter looked up and asked a simple question, one that hit him harder than any executive meeting, any ratings report, or any health scare. "Dad, when will you finally take a break?" She didn't ask it with frustration or disappointment. She asked it with love, a gentle concern, a tone that carried more truth than Pat wanted to admit. He smiled, trying to brush it off with humor, but the question lingered in his chest long after the conversation moved on. It followed him through dinner. It followed him as he lay in bed that night. It echoed in his mind the next morning while he prepared for another day of hosting. When will you take a break? The question wasn't about rest. It was about life. It forced him to confront something he had spent years avoiding. Time doesn't slow down just because we're busy. And Pat's life had been busy for more than 40 years. His wife, who had watched him work tirelessly for most of their marriage, also sensed the change in him: his growing exhaustion, his emotional distance, the quiet sadness he tried to hide behind smiles. One night, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You've given everything you can to that show. Maybe it's time to give something back to yourself." Pat didn't respond right away. He couldn't. Her words carried a truth he wasn't ready to face. He thought about the birthdays he missed, the school plays he couldn't attend, the family vacations cut short because filming schedules changed, and the countless little moments that passed quietly while he stood under studio lights. He wasn't ashamed of his dedication. He loved what he did, but he finally realized how much he had sacrificed along the way. For the first time, Pat felt the weight of regret, not because he dedicated his life to Wheel of Fortune, but because he had never allowed himself to step back and simply be present. That night, he made a promise, not to the show, not to the audience, but to the people who knew him beyond the cameras, a promise to spend more time at home, a promise to slow down, a promise to choose life over routine, and most importantly, a promise to walk away before the price became too high. It was the hardest promise he ever made, but the one he knew he had to keep. The studio was nearly dark when Pat Sajak returned for the last time. This wasn't a taping day. There were no producers running around, no contestants rehearsing introductions, no cameras adjusting their angles. Just silence, a deep, respectful silence, as if the building itself understood that something historic was about to happen. Pat walked across the familiar floor slowly, almost deliberately, like a man retracing the footsteps of his own life. Every step carried decades of memories, decades of laughter, unpredictability, and shared joy with millions of viewers around the world. He reached the center of the stage, the spot where he had stood for more than 40 years, and allowed himself a long moment to look around. He wasn't just looking at a set. He was looking at an era, his era. After a deep breath, he began speaking, not to an audience, not to producers, but almost to himself, and to everyone who had ever watched him from their living rooms. "For years," he said quietly, "people asked me when I would retire, and I always joked I'd leave the moment someone younger, better looking showed up." He chuckled softly, but the smile faded quickly. "But the truth, the real truth, it wasn't a joke. I knew this moment had to come." He looked toward the iconic puzzle board, dim but still majestic. Even silent, it felt alive, like it was listening. "I didn't leave because I was tired," Pat said. "I didn't leave because the show changed. I didn't leave because of pressure, or ratings, or age." He stepped closer to the wheel and placed his hand on it one last time. The same wheel he had touched thousands of times. The same wheel that had carried a lifetime of moments. "I left because every story deserves the right ending." The room swallowed his words, letting them sink in like a gentle wave. Pat had watched many legends stay too long. He'd seen stars whose careers faded painfully, whose final years on screen felt forced, strained, or sad. He didn't want that, not for himself, and not for the show he loved. "I wanted to step away while the show was still beautiful," he continued. "Still magical, still something families looked forward to every night." He didn't want his goodbye to feel like an ending that dragged on. He wanted it to feel like a perfect closing chapter, one filled with gratitude instead of exhaustion, pride instead of pressure. Pat walked to Vanna's spot, gently touching the podium where she had stood beside him for decades. Their partnership was unbreakable. Their friendship, timeless. He smiled softly, and I wanted to leave while Vanna and I still shared the chemistry people loved. I didn't want the audience to watch us grow apart or fade. I wanted them to remember us at our best. He turned back toward the silent wheel and lowered his voice, but above all, I left because I knew the time had come for me to be Pat, not just the host of Wheel of Fortune. For decades his identity had been tied to the show. People recognized him everywhere. They called out his name, praised him, remembered his jokes. But somewhere along the way, he lost pieces of himself. Moments he missed, years he couldn't get back, parts of his life he had set aside to keep the show alive. Now, finally he was choosing himself. He walked slowly toward the exit, pausing at the edge of the stage to give one last look at the place that shaped him, challenged him and made him a household name. "It's not an ending," he whispered, "it's a beginning." And with that, Pat Sajak, television legend, cultural icon, and the man who guided generations through puzzles and laughter, took his final step off the Wheel of Fortune stage. Not as a host, not as a symbol, but as a man ready to start a new chapter of his life.